Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and a kind of a deja vu moment. I was just doing this a few minutes ago. Anyway, the classic Hollywood movie 12 O'Clock High has left us with an idea that there was a bad bomb group in the 8th Air Force. Luke Truxal, author of Uniting Against the Reich, the American Air War for Europe, links in the description below, is here to explain whether or not there's any truth in that reality, that myth. So, good evening, Luke. How are you today?
Doing good, doing good. And again, I will say this is a fun topic for me to talk about because I was initially an intern when I was in college at Abilene Christian. I was an intern for the East Anglia Air War Project, where we did oral histories and worked with primary sources, but also that eventually evolved to me being an intern for the 306 Bomb Group Association for 2 years, where I got to meet some of these people, do some oral histories. But then when I went to grad school and I started research for the book, I looked at things from the 8th Air Force. And as a result, I ended up finding the other side of the story of this, which is I got the 8th Air Force side and also the 306 Bomb Group side, which is rather interesting. It shows the complexities of this story. And it's one of those stories where the film's not lying, but there's multiple truths going on here. And that can happen in a scenario like this. And so the film, what you see, is not lying. It's not inaccurate in how it's portrayed. It's just the 8th Air Force's perspective. The actual truth of what's going on is much different, but the film's not lying. That's just what Acker and the 8th Air Force think was happening in 1942 and 1943.
Brilliant. So over to you.
So the film 12 O'Clock High, to give a quick summary, basically tells the story of a bomb group that is based on the 306 bomb group. The 918th bomb group is 306 times 3. And the story starts with Colonel Keith Davenport struggling to get this group going. And eventually, the commander of the 8th Air Force decides that he has to fire Davenport because he's too close to his men. There's a lack of discipline. There's problems with the missions. They're not doing a good job. And so he brings in his Mr. Fix-It, which is Gregory Peck's character, Brigadier General Frank Savage. And so the film has been lauded for its historical accuracy and examination of the air war. I will say it's one of the most accurate air war films that you will ever see. But a closer look at the film and the history of the 306 bomb group basically forces us to basically talk about an uncomfortable part of film and history, which is that sometimes there are multiple truths happening. Yeah. And also sometimes memory can affect the actual history. Sometimes memory is not right, and so a better analysis of this film is that it's a compilation of stories that include the 306 bomb group, and the 306 bomb group, I would say, is the framework for the film, but other stories are being brought in to tell the story. So the 306 bomb group is not a bad group, but the story of a bad bomb group is being used with that story in the film. So again, this is basically a compilation of stories. That's something you have to remember when watching the film.
Yeah.
On the next slide. Now, the story that happens, and this is kind of the basics of what happens. Davenport, who gets fired, is based off the person of Colonel Charles Chip Overacker, the original commander of the 306 bomb group. He's in the far right on the picture of the left, talking to King George VI. And it's believed by the 8th Air Force that he has gotten too close to his men. There's a lack of discipline. The group's having problems, and they need to bring in a disciplinarian commander and an experienced commander in the form of Colonel Frank Armstrong, who'd worked with the 97th bomb group to fix the 306 bomb group. Frank Armstrong's pictured here in the center and the right. And basically, that becomes the narrative of how Acker sees what happens. He sees Frank Armstrong come in, he sees the group improve, and he thinks that it was Frank Armstrong who fixed all the problems. But again, that's not necessarily everything that's happening. But again, that gives you the basis of the story and who these actual people are. Funny thing enough, if you actually watch the film, you'll see all the major figures in the film in pictures in the background of the headquarters, except for Charles Overacker. Funny story. I was laughing when I noticed that. Go to the next slide. So the question then becomes, is this 12 O'Clock High narrative? And one thing we have to examine when we examine the narrative is who is writing the narrative. And so the important thing to understand is that Acker has a lot of skilled staff officers who are very good at writing who are working with him. You have Bernie Lay, who will be an author of the script. You also have Cy Bartlett, and you also have James Parton, who will write the biography for Acker. So if we can go to the next slide, I meant to spend more time on this, but we can go to the next slide and show who these guys are. But Bernie Lay actually does, I believe, serve with the 100th Bomb Group for a short time. He was on the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, which we'll see in Masters of the Air, hopefully. Cy Bartlett, who is also a script writer. And what you see that these men have compiled is Aker's perspective. And let me also say this. These guys were also there for these events. Bernie Lay Jr. and Cy Bartlett were there for the firing. I think Lay was actually the one that was there for the famous guard waving through Aker incident. That did happen. And in fact, that made Aker so angry that he couldn't stop talking about it the entire car ride back to 8th Air Force headquarters. So that did really make him mad. So again, these events are true. These people who wrote the film were actually there. But again, we're seeing how they viewed it from the 8th Air Force side, not the 306 Bomb Group side. And so what they're telling is the story of the 8th Air Force. I'll go to the next slide, and this is where I'll start kind of taking a little bit more time. But when we look at this narrative, when we look at what we see with the 8th Air Force and what they're basing this narrative and this decision on, when we look at Aker's own communications, we see that he did seriously believe that Overacker was a problem. Numerous messages and memos that he wrote saying before the incident and after the incident, saying that Colonel Charles Overacker was a problem. We had to get rid of him. And he says he was glad he had Frank Armstrong handy, and he was glad after Armstrong, they went to Putnam, Major Claude Putnam later on to continue to command the 306 Bomb Group. So Aker truly believes this. Something to also understand in the context of this whole narrative is that Aker's under pressure to produce results with the 8th Air Force. He himself is under a lot of pressure, not only to be successful. He has just taken command of the 8th Air Force when this has all happened. The previous commander, Carl Spaatz, has been moved to the Mediterranean Theater of Operations, and it is on Aker to prove daylight precision bombing. In January of 1943, we will see the Casablanca Conference, where that whole doctrine will be challenged. If you listen to the narrative of the film, that is a major thing, that they got to prove daylight precision bombing. And that's a whole nother myth we could get into in another episode. But again, Aker is under a lot of pressure to produce results. So he doesn't have time to wait to see if a commander can work out or not. So let's talk about what's going on with the 306 Bomb Group from his perspective. There are red flags that Aker is getting that predate even Aker's command of the 8th Air Force that say that there's some problems here. First, the bombing results are not great. They are missing the target. They are not even getting within the striking point of the target, within 1,000 feet of target. So the post-bombing results are not good. They are missing. Number two, they are starting to show some problems with formation flying. I've seen, again, incidents on their first mission to Lille where basically one bomber broke out of formation to cover a wounded bomber, which is bad. Yes, you're thinking that's good. You're trying to help your buddy out. That's bad for the formation because the B-17s rely on the combined firepower of the formation to protect the formation. When a B-17 drops out to protect another that is wounded, that weakens the firepower of the formation and threatens the formation stability. So a couple of those incidents had happened that were concerning. And again, mostly what I see is, if we're talking about the missions themselves, it's bombing accuracy, too loose of formation flying, and incidents of bombers breaking formation. But again, it's nothing major, nothing that just makes me go, something's wrong. It's something I see. It's like it's a new group learning to fight. Here's where Aker really becomes concerned. On November 3rd of 1943, there's a big inspection of the 8th Air Force bases, which includes Carl Spaatz, then commander of the 8th Air Force, Ira Aker, head of 8th Bomber Command, and King George VI, and all the other dignitaries that follow. Every other group does very well at this inspection. Very trim, very sharp, very polished. They arrive at Thurlive, where the 306 is based, and there's nobody there to greet them. They arrive at Overacker's headquarters, and he's not there. And there's a picture I've seen in the 306. They have it. 306 has it. You might be able to find it somewhere online where they're just all standing there. You have George VI. You have Carl Spots, and you have Aker just sitting there at his headquarters, just standing there, and someone decided to snap a photo, and they're just standing there with their hands in their pants going, okay, where's the king is here. Come on, you need to put on a show, and the inspection's bad. It's really bad. Guys are milling around, walking around. They have to get crews together to get them in formation. It was a bad inspection from all accounts, to the point where, as they're driving away from Thurlai, the person who first suggests that Overacker needs to be fired is not Aker. It's Carl Spots. Spots says, and Parton puts this in his book, he says, Carl Spots said to Aker, I think you might have to fire Chip Overacker when I leave. To which Aker says, I think you might be right. So again, you have a really bad inspection. So all these small problems now get highlighted because you just had this really bad inspection that needed to go well. But then you also got to remember you have other groups that, while I would say everybody in the 8th Air Force is struggling, you have some groups that are doing better than others at trying to adjust. The 305th Bomb Group, led by Curtis LeMay, while is struggling, is trying to find ways around the problem. LeMay's experimenting with formations at this time, where we start to get those formations that we're more familiar with. He's experimenting with bombing tactics. And so Frank Armstrong did the same thing with the 97th. He experimented with bombing tactics. So you see commanders going above and beyond, just running their formations and getting them to the target. They're trying to figure out ways to fix the problem. So again, that kind of highlights, you have two groups that are now trying to fix these problems that they're running into. And you have Overacker, who had this really bad inspection with the 306 Bomb Group. So again, now you have all eyes on this group. And there's another inspection that goes really bad. Seeing some more troubling signs between November and some high losses in November for the famous San Nazaire raid. Aker decides on a whim. He goes, I got a bad feeling about what's going on down at Thurlai. I'm going to go down there myself, unannounced. He shows up, and this is where the famous gate incident happens, where the guard waves him through the gate. And again, I think it was Bernie Lay who was in the car with him, and Frank Armstrong as well. And based on what Bernie Lay said, that was it. The waving through the gate, nothing that Overacker did from that point would have saved him, because by that point, Aker was just he'd blown up. He was angry, and he felt that showed a lack of discipline, and basically that they needed a tougher guy to come on in. And so when we look at these 8th Air Force sources, all indications are, if you're looking at this from their perspective, from their headquarters, and from every bit of evidence they get, there was a problem with Chip Overacker. There was a problem with the group and discipline, and they had to make a move. So again, that's what you see play out on film. That's not necessarily the entire truth, though. Remember, these guys don't get to see what happens on the group level every day. They get snapshots, and those snapshots, while not many, all indicate there are problems that need to be fixed. So what is the 306 Bomb Group story? What do they say? Well, their stories all indicate that there's a bit of a divide. Those who come after the whole incident and the relief seem to indicate that there was a problem. But I get the vibe from those interviews that they're basing that off of kind of what they've heard, not necessarily what actually happened. Those who were actually there and knew both commanders never felt that there was a problem. They never noticed any major changes. And again, I got to meet a guy by the name of Alfred McMahon, who he liked Overacker and he liked Armstrong, and he didn't feel like any major changes were needed. And he felt everything really went well. So when we look at what the veterans are telling us, is that the veterans who were there during those events basically feel like no major changes happened, and that, you have good groups and good crews there. In fact, pictured here is McMahon with his crew, but the pilot, Robert Reardon, if you look at his story, amazing pilot, did incredible things, strong, tough disciplinarian on his crew, and in fact was, the king was impressed with him and his discipline during that November 3rd inspection, so much so that he got invited to, I think, a dinner or something. So again, the 306, if you look at the individual crews, you don't see really any major problems. And I think that they're telling the truth, that there were no major problems. But again, 8th Air Force doesn't get that full picture. So if we go to the next picture, we'll see the best person who could tell us if there was a problem would be the guy who took over. Frank Armstrong's diaries and stuff, there's a lot that he has that is digitized, that is available. His memoirs make no mention of the group being enforced. In fact, he says, I got lucky. I got a really good group handed to me. I was asked to come in. I come in and find out I got a really good bomb group, you know. And in fact, he really got dumped in on the 306 bomb group. It doesn't happen like in the film. He was with Aker in that inspection, and Aker was so mad he fired Overacker on the spot, left Armstrong there, and said, "I'll send your stuff," you know. And so Armstrong really got dumped in on that situation, but he formed some friendships with the members of the 306. There's no tension. He comes away saying it's a very good bomb group. And he does not encounter any of the problems that get displayed in the film. He doesn't have to retrain them. He doesn't have to shut them down. In fact, probably does do a little tightening of the discipline, but not like you see in the film. And so, again, one of the things when I live tweeted the film one night, I said, I got nothing to say in the second half of the film because most of this didn't happen. So, and again, you look at other, you look at the people outside the group, they don't notice any major changes as well. So, with Ralph noted in the 305th Bomb Group. So again, there's no major changes that we're seeing in terms of performance. They are getting better, but I would say the 8th Air Force is getting better, in 43. And so again, another sign that this is a good group is that if major changes were needed, he would not only be there for a month. He was there from the 3rd of January of 43 to the 17th of February. He brought in one of his own executive officers, Major Claude Putnam, basically handed over the command to him in February and was out. And so there's not a lot of changes that he has to make. There's a few, changing the executive officer, moving some squadron commanders around, but nothing whole scale. A lot of the squadron commanders stay, not a lot of retraining done. It's a good group. So again, Frank Armstrong, if he needed to do some whole scale changes, they would have kept him there longer to make those changes. He's able to pass off command to one of his own handpicked guys really quickly. So again, that indicates that he was not worried that he had to stay longer, and Aker did not feel the need to keep him there longer. Aker wanted him for another command. So again, there's nothing to indicate that there's anything wrong with this group. So if we go to the next slide, what is the group that is the basis of these discipline problems? That's the 97th Bomb Group for a very short time period and a very specific time period. In July, throughout the summer of 42, the 97th Bomb Group came into England. It's the first big American bomb group in England to wage the air war against Germany and the Axis. When they arrived, there's a lot of problems. Discipline problems, poor formation flying. In fact, their shooting is so bad that they don't hit the target that's being towed. They hit the plane pulling the target. So there's all kinds of problems. There's problems with the group commander and discipline. So there's a number of issues with this group. Armstrong is brought in to train up the group. I think it's at the end of July, 31st of July. Cusland is fired. Armstrong comes in and he gives them a crash course on training for about 2 weeks and gets them ready and combat ready for that first mission on the 17th of August, 1942. So what we see is that story about the group being bad. It's really the 97th Bomb Group, and it's that 97th Bomb Group really for a very short time when it's first coming in. So if we go to the next slide, I think that's the conclusion. So was this a bad group? In reality, the 306 Bomb Group was not at peak performance in 1942, but neither was the 8th Air Force. Bombing accuracy was a problem for every group in the 8th Air Force in 1942, and to some degree for the remainder of the war. It gets better over time, but again, they're not going to be as accurate as ideally needed to carry out daylight precision bombing the way they wanted to in 42 and 43, which is why they changed in 44. Spots, Aker, and their staffs were convinced there was a problem that they had based on the information they had. And again, those snapshots tell them changes are needed and major changes are needed. A deeper analysis of Overacker really, I think, puts a question on him as a commander. I think there might be a case to firing Overacker. But again, I think it's a harder case to make, but in the sense that I'm not sure if he's a good commander or not, but he's definitely, I wouldn't say that's a hard question to answer. But if there was any question at all, it is with Overacker, with the 306 Bomb Group. But the 306 Bomb Group itself is a very good group based on what you can see in their performance and their later performance and Armstrong's own testimonies. The systematic discipline problems are the 97th Bomb Group story. That's what we see. And again, it shows us that this is a compilation of stories. And finally, This is a case where the film is accurate in the events that it portrayed, but it's a compilation of accurate stories, not necessarily all pertaining to the 306 bomb group. And so I think I got that in 20 minutes.
You did.
So I got a little bit
One
fast at the
second
end.
ahead. You had 1 second to spare. So, I mean, as we were talking just briefly before you went live, Luke, I mean, it's how can you explain a gradual learning curve in a 2-hour movie? It's impossible.
Yes.
You have to have some kind of moment. And as we know, and 12 O'Clock High is one of those movies that does sit broadly in the authentic category. It's not Guns N' Navarone. It's not Where Eagles Dare. It's not a fantasy movie. But because of that, however many generations have grown up with that movie and the TV series it spawned have kind of given it lots of praise and lots of suggestion that it is authentic. But as you've explained brilliantly, it's part of lots of different stories coming together, which is what we're here to do. So, and in kind of connecting to that, Paul Scott is saying, I don't think you can make wholesale changes to any unit with regards to personnel, peacetime or wartime. I mean, it's to make improvements, you can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. You've got to kind of go in there and make some kind of gradual, harsh, sudden changes, like in sport when a new coach comes in, don't tend to bear results.
Yeah, you one of the things that again, you can't just do whole scale changes. The closest you'll see to whole scale changes in the air war come at the end of 43 and early 44, which I talk about in my book, and a lot of that's top level stuff. And even then, it's not really like people getting fired; it's people getting reshuffled into better jobs. You know, it's like you fit better here. You know, you fit better here. So again, that's the closest you'll see to whole scale changes. But again, that's mostly reshuffling, not firing.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, Luke, we will leave things there. As I said at the beginning of the show, your book is available to order, and we will have you back on at some point in Masters of the Air season to talk about the series and the impact of that and maybe expand on this. But we've done what we're supposed to have done now, which is examine a myth. And it's one of those ones where we're not completely debunking it. We're looking at it and saying it's partly true, but partly completely false. And I think that's going to be the nature of these shows. Sometimes we just go, no, it's a complete myth. Other times it's a little bit more in the middle somewhere, but you've done it expertly. So, Luke, I will speak to you again at some point. And, folks, I'll be back in 7 or 8 minutes with James Jeffries talking about the Battle of Britain. So thanks, everybody, for watching. See you in a few minutes. Cheers. Thanks, Luke. Thanks, viewers. Bye.